Hello and welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be doing another book recommendation video, but this one is going to be specific to stories that I think deal with the topics of grappling with your sexuality as well as your religious beliefs and trying to contend with these two elements of your life and your family influence and the cultural influence and the reality of the world around you versus who you know or who you think or who you question yourself to be. And I think that a lot of these books were really meaningful to me in that way, and from the perspective of someone who grew up in a very Christian, religious, Southern American sort of background and childhood, I think a lot of these books kind of come from that place and less so any other religious experiences with grappling with your sexuality. So that's kind of going to be specific to that. Like that's what's going to kind of color the books that I feel really resonate with me and were really impactful for me to read. Yeah, let's just get into the books. The first book that I want to mention is the book that made me want to make this video in the first place, and I read it pretty recently. It's called Her Name in the Sky by Kelly Quinlan. This book was an indie-published young adult contemporary romance set in New Orleans, Louisiana in the 2012-ish era, following these high school seniors, this friend group that consists of some girls, some boys who are all pretty popular, quarterback, the class president, you know, those types of people. And we're coming in from the perspective of a girl named Hannah. She's not any particular like leader or whatever. She's kind of really integral to the structure of this group, and she realizes that she has feelings for Baker, who is the girl in the group who is the class president. And they obviously, it's like a Southern religious environment, and they also go to a private Catholic school. So we see Hannah and Baker really grapple with their sort of religious guilt and the trauma that... Okay, sorry, I had to go out for an hour or so. So now that I'm back, the lighting is obviously super different now. So yeah, let me just get right back into describing Her Name in the Sky by Kelly Quinlan. I think I stopped where I was talking about how Baker and Hannah really have to struggle against and for their feelings for each other. And Baker in particular really feels incredible amounts of religious guilt and pressure around her feelings towards Hannah. Honestly, it made me cry, that it made me really frustrated because I saw how much the sexual repression, like the repression of your own identity, was so damaging and harmful to not only Baker, but especially to Hannah. It was so heartbreaking to see. And I think this book does such a beautiful job at exploring how someone can really work through that despite all of the religious pressures around you and your priests preaching about how gay marriage is sinful. And I think something that was really sweet in this book was how the parents were supportive of their children because they loved their children, and even if they didn't understand them, that love was just unconditional. And that sort of unconditional support and love in books with queer main characters can be so refreshing to read about when a lot of people cannot relate to that reality. And these parents in this book, they just made me so fiercely happy in how they were protective of their kids, even in the face of the headmaster of the school and the gossiping and there's also some violence in here as well. Obviously, tons of trigger warnings and content warnings for like homophobia, and specifically like Catholic homophobia, and like actual fights and partying, underage drinking, stuff like that. This was an incredible read, and it emotionally connected with me so much on the way that it explored religion and family and love and friends and community and the high school dynamics of different cliques and different friend groups and the parties you go to and who you actually like being around and who you don't, in this way that it didn't feel silly or too lighthearted. It was serious, and it took these teenagers' emotions seriously, which I really appreciate. The next book I want to talk about is another sapphic book, but this is a fantasy. It's a retelling of a Portuguese princess's / queen's history, and how she was the Princess of Aragon and married the King of Portugal to, bind the nations together. And in this book, she has a magical curse in which every piece of food she touches turns into flowers, and her country is undergoing an incredibly damaging famine, as well as a disease that's ravaging the entire nation. So she's just really struggling, and she's been engaged to this guy for like years now, but they've been putting off the marriage because she's so physically weak, because she's literally unable to eat because everything she touches turns into flowers. Because this is, Portugal, and it's, in the ye olden princess queen times, there's incredible amounts of like Catholic, Christian, religious influence, even especially within the monarchy, and the way that the Pope and the religious figures in this book have so much power, and how they manipulate her, and how the spirituality and religiousness of our main character, whom we're in the perspective of, really makes her struggle with not only her magic but also her own feelings about this bruja that she basically binds herself to, that can kind of help her get control of her magic. So this book kind of takes that sort of metaphor of accepting yourself, accepting your magic, accepting your feelings and who you are and your identity, instead of violently rejecting it due to the circumstances that you happen to find yourself in, and the ways that you can take advantage of and be critical of the realities that you live in, despite how difficult it might be. And the way that our main character, as a pious, kind, and truly righteous woman, is able to discover herself as someone who is a lesbian, someone who has never felt attraction for men and never will. It was so beautiful to see, and I thought that it was so wonderfully and intelligently done, the way that the raw, potent kind of sexual chemistry and the romantic tension between our two female main characters in its relation to how our main character discovers herself, as well as how she uses her magic and how her political power and the way she has to maneuver around the realities around her. I thought it was fantastic. So suspenseful, gripping, and thrilling every single step of the way, and it really was something that I wish that I had read when I was younger, in terms of being able to accommodate my feelings and my commitment to both my idea of faith and what feels so integral to my identity at that time, versus the realities of the feelings that I had and what I knew to be true about myself. This book did it incredibly well, and I loved it. The next book I want to recommend, and that I think falls under this category of religious books that deal with queer themes and coming of age and the sort of difficulties that lie within that, is Boy Erased by Gerard Conway. This book is a memoir, and it's about the gay son of a Baptist preacher who was, very much like an extremist, very right-wing, American South, and Gerard's experience being sent to a conversion therapy program, and the ways that he had to grapple with the messaging that was targeted towards him from this Christian program, and the ways that it was incredibly damaging, and the ways that his father's continued abuse of him. We see that play out throughout time, and we see his own experiences with his own sexual awakening, and also his experiences with assault and being assaulted in college. This book is so heavy. There are so many trigger warnings. Please look them up. There's also a movie adaptation, and I watched it. It's not as good as a memoir, of course, because it's a fucking memoir and it's incredible. But the last chapter of this book, I remember just desperately sobbing and crying over it. It was so heartbreaking. And the way that our main character our author who wrote this memoir about his own life contends with his deep understanding of heaven and hell and faith, because, literally raised by a preacher, and the abuse and horrifying reality of his home life and his horrifying experiences at conversion camp, and still being able to find peace, joy, happiness, self-acceptance, and love while working through the trauma and the horror of all of that. It was so incredible and heartbreaking to see. And I don't think people talk about this book enough on BookTube, because this memoir is top tier. It is incredible. It is so heart-wrenching. That coming of age, questioning your sexuality, and being so fearful and knowing the consequences of it and experiencing the consequences of it. It was incredible. The next book I want to recommend is The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Philia. And this book is a short story collection that kind of loosely follows a group of people who are all Black women at a Black church. And it's like contemporary. And we follow a range of people and perspectives, from like a grandmother to a teenager and everyone else in between. And some of the stories in here are definitely sapphic, and the way that a lot of these characters come to terms with their own sexuality in contrast to the religious repression of the institutions that they were raised in and that are so culturally ingrained and integral to these people's identities and these characters' sense of self, how it worked with these characters understanding that they are queer, or they are just not straight, they're not cishet, and the ways that the others around them, the family members and the church community members, kind of view that. Also in contrast to the kind of moral backwardness and hypocrisy of the way that a lot of church leaders and the patriarchal functions of the church would mean that they're like, you would condemn adultery and sin, but the same person doing the condemning is the same person committing those acts the night before. Stuff like that. I think that it kind of talks about that religious hypocrisy, as well as the importance of religion in identity, experience, culture, and how that shapes your perspective, because we jump into the mind of so many different people. It's interesting to see the perspective of a queer young person trying to figure out her sexuality and her identity, in contrast to the grandma that she lives with, who is appalled at the reality of queerness. I just thought it was such a beautifully written exploration of Christianity and the Black church specifically, and how that environment and those realities and the cultural realities of that impacts young women and women throughout their lives and their relationships to each other and to their family and to their loved ones. It was stunning and beautiful. Amazing. The next book I want to recommend that I think deals with a main character who is a young person coming to terms with her sexuality, and not even just coming to terms with it, but kind of coming to terms with it in the context of her religious background. This book is Milkfed by Melissa Broder, and this is about a young Jewish woman, this Reformed Jewish girl, who has a really strained relationship with her mother, and even more strained relationship with her body and food. So huge trigger warnings for eating disorders and body dysmorphia and all of that. Like, it's really bad. And the book goes into detail about it. But this book kind of follows our main character as she kind of falls in love with this Orthodox, conservative Jewish woman who is very fat and works at a family frozen yogurt shop. And the way that this character kind of awakens an element of our main character, and their relationship is so interesting and fraught and weird, and the way that the love interest's family and the tight-knit sort of Jewish dynamics of that, along with the kind of conservative social views that the family holds, in contrast to our main character, who is just like a socially liberal, reform Jewish girl who doesn't really feel that connected to her Jewish identity in even a cultural or religious sense because of her distance from her mother. It was so interesting to see, and it was dealt with in this way that felt almost like removed, but still really intelligent. I think that if you like the way Tessa Moshfegh writes, or you like that sort of depressed millennial woman genre of book, you would love this. And the way that it explores religion and sexuality is absolutely brilliant, because even though we don't get the perspective of the love interest, we're in the first person like POV of our main character who has eating issues. The way that she perceives how her love interest interacts with their family and how her family interacts with her and how all these dynamics play out reveals so much about the social realities that queer Jewish people undergo. The next book I want to recommend is much more lighthearted than any of the books that I've already talked about here, because so many of these are just really dark, contemporary, realistic fiction type of stuff, or allegorical fantasy that very much explores the darkness of religious control and perversion of your mind and your understanding of yourself. And this book is Banned Sinister by KJ Charles. This is a fluffy, light romance book about this brother and sister pair set in like the Victorian London, England sort of vibes, kinda. And basically this sibling duo, they don't really have any money or social standing because of their mom being accused of being like a slut or whatever, you know. So their like aunt or whatever are their like keepers and, you know, fund their ability to just survive. One day, the sister is out riding on horseback in some other person's manor's like field yards, but the manor house that she is on the property of is owned by this group of dudes whom call themselves the Murder. And it's like 3 or 4 guys who are known for being notorious rakes. So in the romance and the historical romance genre, rakes are really rich playboy dudes who kind of fuck around and, you know, are just bad boys, but in the Victorian English countryside setting, okay? So basically, the sister ends up getting her leg broken, and so she has to stay at this notorious rake's, this cabal of notorious rakes' house as her leg heals. And she, you know, the doctor there is like, you know, you cannot fucking move. You can't leave due to the social proprieties of the time. She's just really concerned about how this will reflect on her family name, and because it's already been through so much. But we are in the perspective of her brother, who is really caught up in the morality of Victorian English sort of like gendered sexual politics, and he only begins to understand that there is a world outside of the repression and restriction that he's existed in for so long, for all of his life, when he meets these rakes who are, you know, kind of fruity, kind of gay, bisexual, etc. And he comes to understand his sexuality, and they have like a steamy little romance. But the way that I think those social and religious values are explored in the banter and how it's deconstructed in this humorous and lighthearted way that is still really touching, it was really well done, and I think this is a really solid romance. So the next book I'm going to recommend is The Henna Wars by Adiba Jagadir. Also, massive lighting change again, so sorry about that. But this book is a young adult novel, but to me it feels more like a middle grade, and this kind of deals with a Muslim girl who is, I think she's Bengali? Oh, I don't even remember, I'm so sorry. But this Muslim girl who starts like a henna business for her school project, and her relationship with her like henna business rival, who's this Brazilian girl. It's set in Ireland at an Irish like school. I almost said high school, but that's not what it's called there, is it? We see how our main character kind of struggles to come out to her immigrant parents, to her religious family, the way that her identity and her sexuality really impacts not only how the way her parents like look at her, but the way her whole family perceives her, extended or not. It was so sad, but it wasn't heavy, if that makes sense. It was still like a lighter, contemporary, middle grade, young adult, and I think it was written in this really simplistic way that is really accessible, and just a lovely little story that's targeted towards, really more young adult audiences. And I think it did explore those themes of specifically queerness and coming to understand your identity when you are Muslim and your family is, and how that dealing with that and grappling with that can be so difficult. And I think this book did that in a really interesting way, less internally, more in terms of the way that our main character interacts with her family members and stuff like that. The next book I want to talk about is a pretty cult classic, popular one, and that is The Miseducation of Cameron Post by Emily Danforth. This book was also adapted into a movie, and it was incredible. The movie is so good. I feel like the movie is what Boy Erased kind of wants to be, because it's entirely set at conversion therapy camp, basically, for these teenagers who all come from a variety of different backgrounds. And it's kind of in a rural woods area. It's beautifully shot, and the way that these characters are explored in the movie is fantastic. But in the book, we're not following our main character Cameron Post in just her experiences at this camp, but in her whole childhood and the ways that queerness and lesbianism is so integral to her childhood and to her identity at every step of the way. And she also deals with a lot of trauma because of the way that her parents both died when she was very young, and orphaned her at 11 because they died in a car crash, and so she has to go live with her aunt, who is incredibly Christian and religious. And she gets caught, making out with another girl whom she has a really intense relationship with. And I think this book is just, it's a classic coming-of-age queer book that deals with religious struggles and family and all of that tension, as well as just what it's like to be a teen girl growing up in the 90s, trying to figure herself out, and her quirky interests and her kind of morbid and dark sense of self. I thought it was lovely and just very good. The last book I want to talk about in this book, or in this video, is Alice Walker's The Color Purple, which is a modern classic. This book explores the lives of a Black woman in the late 1800s in the American South, and her realities as someone who is poor, who is expected to raise children and be a wife when she's a fucking teenager, and the sexual and physical and emotional and financial trauma and abuse that she has to undergo, all under the social and religious reality of the strictness of Christianity, and specifically Southern American Christianity. I think that our main character says some very profound things and comes to these realizations about her own relationship to Jesus and to Christianity and to religion in this beautiful way that resonates with so many people. Obviously, it's a classic, while also exploring the intimate relationship and connection she has to this woman that she's been in love with since she was a child. And the book is structured as a series of letters to God, so prayers, and then eventually it transfers and transitions at the end to a series of letters to her sister, and her loved one, the person she's in love with. It was so stunning to see, and it was so interesting to see the ways that our main character, despite everything she goes through, and in fact because of everything she goes through and the social realities and the material conditions that she lives in and exists in, it shapes her to be a person who is just so fucking incredible. And the way that she describes how she understands herself and how she relates to other people throughout this book, the way that her language use changes and almost betters over time over the course of the book, is also a reflection of our main character's heightened literacy throughout the process of the many years that this novel follows her through. And it's honestly so tragic in many ways. And again, look up trigger warnings and content warnings for this, please, because it's heartbreaking, and every possible horrible thing that can happen to a young Black woman in the 1890s happens to her, basically. I still think that the way that this book explores religious identity and how that's not antithetical to your identity as a human being in other ways, in terms of your sexuality and your relationship to your own trauma and your history. They are not different. They can be one and the same if you so choose, and they are not, one is not an abomination to the other, and it was really beautiful. So those are all the books I have to recommend to you today. Most of these are sapphic. I think maybe like 2 of them aren't, due to my own experiences and my understanding of my reality. The same way that most of these books explore like religious trauma and upbringing from a Christian perspective. Again, that's just how I was raised, and those are the kind of books that I think, first of all, are written primarily and marketed towards like a Western audience, and secondly, what tends to resonate with me. But these are pretty much all the kind of religious meets sexuality, identity books that I can really think of that have really emotionally impacted me when I've read them pretty recently, because these are all reads that I've read in the past 3 to 4 years, most of them within the past year. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, you know, all that bullshit. I will see you in my next video. Bye!